Anita, how's your mental health?
Questionable at all times. You know this.
Yeah, how's the mental health of your children?
Also a little bit tricky. Can I tell you my experience in trying to find therapists for myself and my kids, Mel?
Yes, please.
Okay, this is how it goes. You ask around your friends and your family for a referral for somebody who's nearby. You finally find somebody who sounds like they might work for your family. You give them a call and you find out that A, they're not accepting new patients, or B, they have a huge wait list. So you start over again and you ask people if they know anybody who would be a good therapist and a good fit. Finally, you find one, you go and you meet with them and you figure out that you don't actually like them that much. But it's been so much work to find somebody who you can go to in your area that you're kind of stuck with them. Well, do you have any ideas for how to get around this?
I do because guess what? I've actually had some therapists that I have found on my own, which involves what you're saying. Sometimes I remember one time I was like 3 hours in the bathtub on my phone looking
Yeah.
through websites. I was such a prune at the end. But I have also had the experience with working with BetterHelp. And it was like, I don't want to say too good to be true, but because it is true, but it's like amazing because I was matched with my therapist within 24 hours.
And you didn't have to go through all of that other ridiculous process of trying to find somebody. And here's the cool thing too, is if that person didn't work out for you, you can just switch and say, and it's not like you're committing to another years long search for somebody who you're going to jive with.
It's true. And I lucked out, or maybe just BetterHelp is really good at matching people together because I never had to change my therapist. I loved her. Perfect fit for me. And I know that some of our friends have used BetterHelp and they've had to change therapists, and boom, same day, you can change.
Easy peasy.
You can ghost your therapist. Get a new one.
I love this idea. BetterHelp is one of our sponsors. If you use our promo code trybetterhelp.com/WWDN, you get 10% off your first month. And we totally recommend it.
Yes, get some therapy. That's trybetterhelp.com/WWDN.
Hey guys, it's me, Anita. Mel and I were planning to record together with each other today, but it turns out that Mel's Wi-Fi is from the 1900s, so it wasn't going to work out. So you just get me, little old me. I'm not actually even sure where Mel is. I think she's in England somewhere, but I don't know. So, hopefully we'll be able to be back together next week, or maybe not. We're just playing it by ear all the time. I wanted to tell Mel about a dream I had last night, and so I'm just going to tell you all, dear listeners, the dream that I had last night that was relevant. So I had a dream that Jason and I were on vacation. We didn't have any kids with us, and we were having a grand old time. And at some point in time, I thought to myself, and I said to him, hey, didn't you die? And he was like, yeah, but I came back to life. And one of my first thoughts was like, oh, I'm so glad that you're back alive. But I also feel bad for the people whose spouse or partner died, but then they stayed dead. Like, wouldn't that suck? But look, you're alive. And then the dream kept going. And then after a minute, I was like, but wait, didn't you die and then you came back alive miraculously, but then you're actually dead? And it kind of woke me up from my dream enough that I was like, yeah, you're actually dead. That's really what's happening. And so I was like, we have to make the most of this time. I need to stay asleep because I want to remember you as being alive. So we ran to our hotel room, and in an effort to be quick, he ripped the doors of the elevator off, trying to close them really quickly. And we ended up in a different hotel. And then I was like, no, actually, I know that you're dead. And so then the dream was over. It was kind of a bummer, but it was super weird because in that dream, I was like, I know you're dead, but then I know you came back alive. And so, phew, but then you're dead again. So kind of a bummer that, yeah, the real story is dead. Never came back alive. Just dead the whole time. So, I don't know. I think dreams are weird. We hear all about people talking about their crazy dreams in the Widow Wives Club. We had our Facebook hangs yesterday. I was able to go to one of those. It's always fun to meet a face behind that tiny Facebook profile and sometimes a Facebook pseudonym. So got to see a few of you yesterday, and I am glad for all of those who hopped on to the other call as well. And thanks for stepping up and helping as we're trying to figure out how to make all of these different things run and work with people whose brains are not fully functioning. I don't think we have anything exciting coming up in the next week, so hopefully that is true. Although my kids are going back to school this week, so I'm half really excited and half not excited. I want them to go away for several hours during the day. I just don't want to have to wake them up and get them ready in the morning and deal with homework. But you know what? I'm willing at this point in time. All they do is fight with each other all day long and watch YouTube. So nailing it in that category. Maybe I should just go join Mel wherever she is. How are you guys doing? Let us know in the Widow Wives Club. If you're not in the Widow Wives Club, come and join us in the Widow Wives Club. We got a really angry message this week about somebody being super, super mad that we declined their request from the Widow Wives Club. And the reason we decline those requests is because people don't submit all of the information. And if you don't happen to have an obituary or a death notice, we have an email address that you can email for alternate forms of proof. We can almost always figure out a way to say that you are who you say you are. And it was really appropriate this week because I'm in a bunch of other Facebook groups for widows and widowers. And in one of them, somebody pointed out that the administrator and moderators of that group were some shady characters. And they had all of these comments from accounts that were not legitimate accounts. And it looked like they were actually mining for data or for information from a really terrible, like from a group of people who have suffered enough. So it just went to show me, I was like, this is why we go through the trouble of verifying that people really are widows and widowers. It's not because we're trying to gatekeep. It's not because we're trying to keep people out of there. It's because we're trying to protect the people who are in there so that you know when you comment that there's nobody in there that should not be in there to the best of our ability. So anyway, it's always fun to get those messages because we're just trying to help. And thank you to our moderators in the Widow Wives Club who go through. I mean, we get lots of requests every day for those, and those people have to go through and check out their information to make sure they're legitimate. So come join us. It's a really fantastic group. We promise that we're not bots and we're not trying to get your information to sell you something or to scam you, because I am not a doctor of medical surgery from the United Nations. I'm like an actual real person, and we care about you guys. So come join us there. If you want to keep the podcast going, check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/WWDN. This is the part that Mel always says. So I don't know. Go get us some tacos at buymeacoffee.com/widowwedonow. And if you don't want to do those things, then just come and give us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really does help for the people who need to find us to be able to find us. I know you guys do the same thing. When you look at a podcast, you look at the reviews. If there's like a review, you're like, yeah, I don't know if it's worth my time. But if there's lots of reviews, then maybe it is worth your time. So we would really appreciate you doing that. And if you see Mel, say hi and tell her to come back home at some point in time. I'm a little bit worried that she's going to just stay wherever she is. I am so excited for today's episode. I can barely even contain it. So, without further ado, I'm Anita, and Mel is somewhere. And we are both still just trying to figure out widow we do now. It works better when there's two of us. Mel, today is a special day for two reasons. The first one is that it is my birthday.
Oh Oh my gosh, happy birthday. Sorry, I forgot.
And usually I would be like, we're not going to record on my birthday. But when this guest was available on this day, I was like, I don't care what day it is. We are going to talk to her. So that's the second reason that I'm really excited, because I'm so excited to talk to this person.
It's a birthday present for you to have this guest. Tell us who we have.
We have Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, a real live doctor of something, here to talk to us. What are you a doctor of, Mary Frances?
Clinical psychology.
Okay. Should have figured that out beforehand, but that's awkward. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
It's so lovely to be here with you too.
Tell us where you are right now. Where do you live?
I live in sunny Tucson, Arizona. And in fact, we have just started to hit the very, very sunny part of the year. So it's quite hot.
How do you live there in the summer? I don't understand how humans can survive there.
You learn to live like a lizard. It's amazing. So you do things before 10 a.m. and then you go inside and you get all of your work done and you don't emerge again until it's dark.
That's like how I treat skating in the summer. That makes sense.
Yes.
Okay.
It's really the reverse of winter, right? I mean, for most people in the north, there's a period of time where they just wouldn't go outside if they didn't have to.
Yeah, I feel like if you go outside, immediately all of the moisture in your whole body would evaporate and you would be a piece of jerky on the sidewalk.
Oh, gross.
So, you're welcome.
You told us you are a clinical psychologist. Will you tell us also what you do and where you work and all the things?
I am an associate professor at the University of Arizona, which is in Tucson, Arizona. And I also run the GLASS Lab, and that's an acronym for the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab. And I've been doing grief research, for over 20 years now. And, just studying the impact of loss on our brain, on our body. And because of that experience, I wrote a book called The Grieving Brain.
Okay. I have read your book and I think it is so fascinating. And I wonder if you have learned all there is to learn about grief and loss and we're good to go. Like no more is required.
Oh, heavens no. We are really just at the beginning. In fact, a student of mine was just doing what we call a literature search. So trying to determine how many neuroimaging studies have been done on grief. And it was less than 24.
What?
Which I know. So we have a lot left to learn, but we do know some things. And so it's important for that information to get out to people.
What made you want to specialize in grief? Usually people go through a hard time when they choose that. What's your story?
Sometimes we assume that unless we had a huge life insurance payout, we don't really need to know anything about investments or even finances. But guess what? A little knowledge of finances is critical for all of us. Maybe your partner was in charge of that stuff, and now you find yourself making all the decisions. Maybe you're mad about that. Maybe I am. Nicole from the He's Gone But the Money's Not podcast is here to help. She tackles financial literacy by telling the stories of women and widows and finance experts and shares the lessons they've learned as certified financial planners. Whether you know a lot and feel confident in your financial decisions or feel unsure about all of that stuff, there is more to learn. Listen and subscribe to the He's Gone But the Money's Not podcast on all podcast platforms. This ad was paid for by Rockhouse Financial, an SEC registered investment advisor.
I was already in graduate school studying clinical psychology when my mother died. I was 26, and she had had breast cancer since I was 13. So it was a long time coming, but it meant that, I just felt really comfortable with people who were grieving. And I think that somehow it meant that when I was interviewing people, I was listening really closely to what they were telling me about their experiences, about their thoughts and feelings. And then because I have a neuroscience background, so that's sort of my research area within clinical psychology, I was able to sort of match up what they were telling me about their experience with these brain images that I was getting from the neuroimaging scanner. And so maybe it just gave me a different kind of insight because of this willingness to approach the topic.
It sounds like your whole area of research is kind of a bummer, though. I mean, like just talking about dead people and like sad people all the time.
You know, my students often tell me I am way too happy to be doing this work. And the reality is those are not unconnected, right? So when you think about death in a not too infrequent way, it certainly puts a lot of things in perspective. So when students are arguing with you about a grade or, you know, all those random small work-related things you have to deal with, there's a part of me that just can let it roll off me, because in the big picture, I do what I do because life is short and I think this is something meaningful I can do. And so I think they're not unconnected. I do experience grief. I think about grief. I think about death, but it's just the flip side of the meaning that life has taken on for me.
I think you're the perfect person for this job. So good job in finding that.
Yeah, because if you're too sad, like it would be the worst, right? And then you would study people and it would also be the worst. So I think it's good. It's good balance.
I think the balance part is so important. And I actually just recently, a friend of mine had a baby, and I asked if I could take care of the baby on the weekends for, you know, a couple of hours, because babies are like the anti-grief. And I realized I was spending so much time thinking about grief that I really needed to think about, you know, mushed bananas and diapers, exactly. But you know, the way they like come online and, you know, reach out to hug you, all of those feelings are important parts of life too. And I don't want to devote all of my mental energy and space to grief.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get into kind of some of the topics that you study, because this is so fascinating. So you do some studies. Now tell me if I'm explaining this wrong, because I probably am. But you will take people who are experiencing grief and you will put them in some sort of a neuroimaging scanner. So is it a functional MRI? Like what kind of a scanner, a functional MRI? And then you will say, or have them talk about different experiences, or you'll show them pictures of loved ones, and then you map out what parts of the brain light up when you're doing these really specific and special. I mean, you have to be really creative in how you map out what you're going to show to them, because you're trying to get to, is this grief? Is this just a normal response to a picture? And then you kind of see what the reaction is when somebody's going through grief versus just like a regular human normal experience. Is that a good way to explain what you're doing?
You have covered so much of it. That was incredible. So the interesting thing is that to experience grief, it's because we have love, right? It's because we have this bond with someone. And so what that means is I can't just show them any pictures in the scanner. I need to show them a picture that elicits their thoughts and feelings about this person who's died. And so when they come in for an interview into my lab before the scan, I ask them to bring photographs of the person who has died. And then I'm able to scan those into a computer and show them to the person on goggles while they're lying in that MRI scanner. Which is just like you would lie in a scanner for an MRI of your knee or of your heart or something, except because of the way the brain flows, blood flows in the brain, and because blood has iron in it, that magnet allows us to see where it's flowing, and that actually tells us where the neurons are firing. And so we get a very clear understanding of which parts of the brain are responding when we're looking at this photograph.
It's so fascinating, and like I can't believe somebody figured out how to do that.
So is this something where you study people within a certain time period from like a death or something, or do you do longitudinal studies as well?
I mostly have studied people at one time point. And it's funny you say that, actually, because I realized that I was studying grief. I set out to study grief, and I was studying these, you know, a wave of grief that a person might have while they're in the scanner. But actually, a lot of my curiosity. A lot of my questions were about grieving, were about, just like you said, over time, what changes for this individual. But we have almost no studies yet of what changes in the brain over time, right? Because you'd have to bring the same person back for multiple scans. So we have lots of psychology studies where people come in multiple times and tell us how they're feeling and what they're doing. And so we know a lot about grieving. But that distinction between just grief in the moment and grieving is a really important one.
I volunteer to be scanned for the rest of my life because I'm like, what is going on? It's been 5.5 years for me since my husband died. And so I noticed different things. So that's so fascinating. And I don't think that I ever separated grief and grieving.
It turned out to be really helpful for people once I had sorted through, these are really different questions. And I started talking with people about it. I realized that it really sorted something else out. And that is, you're going to have grief for the rest of your life, right? It's just that reaction in the moment when you're aware that this person who's so important is gone. You're going to have a wave of grief. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you, even if it's been years since the person died, because that's just the natural human reaction. But we can also say that grieving is the way that grief changes over time. So it doesn't go away, but for most of us, those waves of grief are less frequent or less intense, or even if they're exactly the same, they become more familiar, oh, I am going to get through this moment, as awful as this is. Or even, if I'm thinking about my dad at Christmas, I'll reach out and text my sister some silly story about him because I've learned how to comfort myself in those moments. And so it means that with grieving, we really are changing over time. We're adapting, we're learning how to live our life now. It doesn't mean that grief ever goes away.
Yeah, that is an interesting difference. And just like a little bit of that word makes a huge difference in the concept.
Yeah.
So when you're doing these scans, are there specific parts of the brain that reliably light up for somebody in grief?
Absolutely. So, Mel, you asked how long ago is the grief usually? And we define that differently in different studies for different reasons. We're interested sometimes in that acute grief response, which is really often very intense for people. And then in other cases, we're very curious about how has their grieving gone? Some people seem to be adapting better than others. And so we're looking more like 2, 3, 4 years after a loss.
What are the different types of grief or loss? Sorry, different types of loss.
Well, so I would say different types of grieving. So when we talk about different types of loss, we often mean, how did the death happen? So was it a traumatic death, like a sudden unexpected death, perhaps a death by suicide or murder, or even heart attack, right? Where we just had no forewarning. So those are often ways that we describe the death itself. But we see different patterns of grieving where for the majority of us, we feel this response initially, this, set of thoughts we can't get out of our head and feelings and not being able to concentrate, not even believing it's really happened. And then we see changes in that over time. Just as I was describing, people's sense of yearning tends to decline. People's sense of acceptance tends to increase over time. And that, for most people, is typical grieving. There is this small group, maybe 1 in 10 people who are bereaved, maybe less. We just don't see that same change over time. So that if I'm talking with them, it's like, I think, gosh, did this just happen? Because of the way they're talking about it, but actually it's sometimes been years. And that group, that trajectory is what we tend to call prolonged grief disorder. And the reason to identify that is because we actually have targeted psychotherapy that we know now can help to get them out of that stuck place and back on that more natural trajectory over time. And so those are some of the different kinds.
It's interesting that you bring up prolonged grief disorder, because that is very controversial in the grief world. You talk about that and you can get some real heartfelt responses about that. And I think a lot of it comes from the feeling of somebody telling you you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Or just having somebody else put their expectations of your grief timeline on you. So when I read about prolonged grief, I can check so many of those boxes in my own life. You know, I still pay my husband's cell phone bill. His clothes are still in the closet. We haven't taken a family picture because I don't feel like our family is whole. Like, I feel that loss it's still a big, huge part of my life. It's been about four years for me. And I also feel like I'm integrating his loss perfectly normally.
Yeah.
So when I, read those checklists that say, if you're not, socially integrating back in like you were before after such and such amount of time, or, you haven't dealt with possessions and things like that, I'm like, well, that's me. And also I don't feel like I belong in the prolonged grief category either. So that's a very interesting topic.
It's such an important topic. And I think you highlight a few points that could be much clearer. I don't think that prolonged grief disorder was really rolled out particularly well. No one did.
The PR group was terrible on that.
Right? So let me give you a couple of examples. So none of those that you mentioned are criteria for complicated grief, for prolonged grief that we used to call complicated grief. Yeah. So some of it is, in order to become a clinical psychologist and to be able to diagnose, say, PTSD and major depressive disorder and so forth, we go through a lot of training of like, what questions do you ask and how do you evaluate the answer? And so it turns out that all of those things you described, that doesn't sound so abnormal to me. And so I think it's knowing what the criteria are, but not just that, it's knowing how to apply them. And so let me put it this way. The other problem with that word prolonged makes it sound like there's some cutoff point. And I think just the way you said it, we're already getting so many messages in our culture that you should be done now, because our culture doesn't really recognize that grief doesn't end. So just like I was saying, right? Grieving can change, and we can be adapting and creating a meaningful life for ourselves that includes grief, right? And so I think the trouble with that term, prolonged grief, is that people think that at a year you should be done. And that's crazy. That's ridiculous. None of our studies show that. But here's what happens at a year that's pretty interesting. So by a year, if we look at that grieving trajectory, for most of us, there's been that change over time. Not to zero, but there's been a change, right? So there's this other group that isn't changing at all. If you come into my office in the first, year of grieving, everyone kind of looks like a mess. I can't predict anything about how you're going to be doing in another year based on how you're doing in that first year. By a year, those two trajectories start to separate. So that by a year, even though your grief is definitely not over, I can tell that if there hasn't been any change so far, it's not super likely there's going to be any change. And so what it means is that at about a year, I can start to predict, which pathway are you on? Not that the path is over, but that I can start to see,
that's so interesting.
Right? This is a person who maybe needs some more skills or a supportive therapeutic relationship, or they need more education about how this works and what's going to help and what's not going to help, right? So that's the reason for a year. No one is done at a year. That's silly. It's, but I think that's what people hear because there's such poor grief education in our society that they're already thinking, gosh, I'm doing it wrong. I'm not normal. I should be done, even though that's not true.
That's like everybody needs to hear it. It's the same. This kind of in a similar way reminds me of like the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. And it's like people hear those little catchphrases and it's like easy to remember. And then they apply it to all death. And it's like, guys, it wasn't meant to study people that are still living.
Well, and just like you say, those are descriptions, right? So a lot of people who are grieving feel angry, right? Like that was a novel idea that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross gave us. And what's important though is, although that is a description of some people's grief, it's not a prescription. So people will say to me, I haven't felt angry yet. And so I'm worried I'm not done, right? Like I'm worried at any time I'm going to hit the anger phase. Well, that's just not how it works. So she was describing experiences people were having in grief. She was not necessarily describing a grieving pattern in research.
Can you just be our best friend and hang out with us all the time? Because you're so fun and this is so helpful too.
See, it's a happy birthday present.
The best birthday present to Anita
ever.
You two are very kind.
Okay. So thank you for helping us understand that a little bit more. I think that year thing really trips people up because
it does.
A year is so small in the grief timeline. And there is this expectation from people around you that by 1 year, things are going to be different somehow. And for a lot of people, the second year is harder than the first year. So to hear that like, oh, you're broken somehow, or you're not doing it right because it's been a year and you don't feel fine.
Yeah.
It's totes crazy. That was education speak right there. That was my
It was very academic.
You also, I think there's this, it's people who are seeking help at a year, right? No psychologist is going out and saying, and you're doing it wrong, and you're doing it wrong. I'm sorry, you're doing it wrong. It's people who come into the office who are looking for help that we're able to say, okay, so let me really understand what you're experiencing. I wonder if this is depression, or, oh, actually it's not depression. I wonder if you're having, prolonged grief. So it's not about the judgment part. It's the, how do we identify the people who most could use some targeted therapy?
Okay, so you just hit on something that I really want to talk about also, and that is grief versus depression. So we have an online Facebook group full of widows and widowers, and there's often people will post and say, is this grief or is this depression? And the honest answer that I always have is, I have no idea. And I've almost come to a place of, does it actually matter? And does it? Answer me this.
So we do know that they are different. This took, a significant amount of research, like 20 years. So it's not an easy question to answer, but here, let me give you, I think, the shorthand. This is the Cliff Notes of how they might be different. Please see your psychologist because your mileage may vary. So the Cliff Notes version is, prolonged grief is about the person who's died. Depression is about everything, right? Depression is like a cancerous metastasis, right? I feel guilty about not being a good daughter, and I worry that I'm never going to get a promotion at work. And I think that really, so major depressive disorder, there is no symptom of major depressive disorder that is yearning for your deceased loved one. Now, you can have depression after the death of a loved one. You can have prolonged grief after the death of a loved one. You can have both. Just like you could have depression and anxiety, you could have depression and prolonged grief, right? So partly, this is why it's helpful to see a therapist, but partly, does it matter? I think in a way that it does. So think about the person who's ruminating about all sorts of things in their life. The way that they might sort through those thoughts could be very different than the person who's just focused on, I can't move forward without this person. So I think it does make a difference. The other thing that we know from research is that antidepressants, which can be really helpful with depressive symptoms, they don't help prolonged grief symptoms. So if you have depression and you're bereaved, it makes sense to take them, but it doesn't actually necessarily make sense to take them if the sole issue you're grappling with is prolonged grief. So I think it does make a difference, but most therapists, even psychiatrists, haven't gotten all the news about this yet.
That's what I was going to ask. I was going to ask, like, what if you're in prolonged grief and like, does every therapist know that that's a thing? And also that maybe antidepressants aren't necessarily the answer. And second part, what's a good course of action?
So I think we have a long way to go educating not only the public, but educating clinicians as well. Most of us, psychologists, therapists, psychiatrists, we get no training about grief. Isn't that amazing? 0 classes about grief. And it's ridiculous because grief shows up in everybody's life, right?
It's like the one thing. That's
right?
like the thing everyone's going to have to deal with.
So I think that one of the good things that I think will come out of the prolonged grief being in the DSM is now clinicians have to figure out what the difference is. In order to be able to identify people who aren't adapting well, they have to know what typical grief looks like. And so it means that all of us have to increase our education about grief. And I think that's going to have a ripple effect in society in general. Yes, I know.
Yes.
Mel is like shaking her fist. Yes.
I know, I'm pumping the air.
Fist pumps. So I'm really curious about this because, Mel and I have the experience that our husbands died. And a husband is integral to every single facet of your life. So I think it would be weird if after the death of your spouse, you were only grieving their death. I mean, it spills over. I mean, when you called it a metastasis, I was like, that sounds a lot like what grief feels like. Everything, my job, my parenting, recreation, all of those things, I feel grief in those categories as well. And so I feel like it's almost, I don't want to say natural, but not surprising if you define depression as things outside of just grieving or yearning for the person who died. Well, now I'm really upset about the rest of my life too. And so I feel like it's kind of natural for there to be a depression that goes with grief. I think it would be weird for people to just have grief. Am I crazy when I say that?
I think, some of that is the language that we use to describe. So what's not typical is that more than a year after a loss, that you're not able to get out of bed more days than not in the morning. Mm-hmm. Or that you have, significant weight loss, Weight loss is really common initially, right?
Yeah.
Really, really common. But eventually our body usually learns to re-regulate. And so having suicidal thoughts, for example, not typical more than a year after a loss. And so if those are the experiences that someone is having, then I do think that they may have depression. And the good news is that can also be treated. So I think this is where it gets a little complicated I can't explain everything about diagnosis, in shorthand, but I can tell you one way that's, I think, helpful is if there is some balance in your life. So I expect that people will have crying jags, right? I expect that people are going to be unsure about what the future holds, right? Or am I doing a good job as a parent? But I also expect that there are times when they get together with friends and they feel really comforted by that. I expect that there are times when they tell stories about their loved one and it actually makes them feel bright and, bittersweet maybe, but there's joy in there. And so a lot of it, I think, is just this. Is there balance in your life? Are you able to do things that you do find meaningful, as well as having times when you just feel like, oh my gosh, my life is completely different than it was before?
Okay, question. When you were talking about the prolonged grief things and what's not typical for prolonged grief after a year, I'm like, oh yeah, me. I mean, I obviously have had it and been, I guess, diagnosed with it. But my question is, and I've noticed a pattern, and we've talked to some other experts, about these things. And so I want to get your perspective on this. Is there a correlation between previous trauma and prolonged grief?
It's a great question. And I didn't even touch on you can have PTSD after a death as well, kind of depending on what the situation was and so forth. So we do know that having had previous mental health issues, that sets us up for it being harder to adapt after something so tragic as the death of a husband or the death of a child. So we know that prior history continues to impact us after the fact. And in fact, I think that as a clinician, you should be asking about what happened before the death, because you're probably going to come at it very differently if this is a long-standing pattern and this particular loss is just one of many examples, as opposed to really things were going along fine and now this has completely ripped the rug out from under you for the first time. Those are two really different experiences, I think maybe one of the ways I like to think about it is bereavement is you walk through a door. You're in a different world, but there's a way that actually our brain and our body has already done this. So that is to say, we all leave home at some point. At some point in our development, it goes from our parents being the most important people in our lives that we turn to for everything. Eventually, there is a peer in our life that we turn to first, right? And so that leaving home, that change in, who's the person we turn to, that is something our brain and body is set up to do because we all do it. And so I think thinking about that means when you're leaving home, right? If you go to college or you go on a mission or whatever you're doing, right, in that interim, it's a delicate time, right? It's a time when you can have drug abuse, you can have depression, suicidal thoughts, right? It's sort of a risky period. But most of us do get through it, right? We make all the little bumps. Oh, wait, you mean I have to file taxes by myself? Right?
Still
right?
working on that one.
So, it takes a long time. No one completes leaving home in a year, but we do have really great experiences, really horrible experiences, and we get through that adaptation. I think it can be helpful to think about bereavement in the same way.
Just a quick question about the studies that went around prolonged grief. Did they examine people with all types of relationship loss? So child, parent, grandparent, spouse, all of those different things?
Yeah, so we know that, kind of as risk predictors, right? The death of a spouse and the death of a child tend to increase the risk for prolonged grief disorder. But I think when you think about it, it's kind of those relationship titles are kind of a proxy for how overlapping are you with this other person, right? And so, I interviewed a woman who she lived next door to her sister. They had stations next to each other at their hair salon where they worked. They took their vacations together, right? They were both married, but it was pretty clear that they were each other's person, And so when her sister died, she had that same sort of response because the category doesn't totally matter. What matters is how integrated you are with that person. How much is it that you're a we functioning in the world and us functioning in the world? And of course, that is often spouses and children, but it can be other people as well.
Thank you. So I asked you before, and I'm going to come back to this question. I'm by education, I'm a physical therapist. And so I have interest in, neurology and kind of how our brains work. And I have been on this mission to tell people that grief is not in our heads, even though it is in our heads, that there are real physiological things that happen when we're in grief. And it's not just that I can't remember stuff, it's no, something is happening in my brain and my body that's not under my control. And it's not something I can just positive think my way out of. Exactly. So I would love to hear about what our brain does when we lose somebody important in our life, when they die.
Yeah. I think you have to start, you can only talk about grief if you first talk about love and bonding, right? So because, and we actually know some of this from vole studies. Voles are these little tiny rodents that run around the prairie of North America. And what's unusual about prairie voles is that they bond for life. Once one prairie vole has fallen head over heels for the other prairie vole, they will prefer to spend time together than with any other vole they come across, right?
Do they go to prom together?
They go to
like, is there a
prom,
ceremony? Okay.
An apartment on the Upper East Side, right?
For $2,000 for a studio apartment.
Exactly. So, but what we know about from this is that when that bonding happens, whether that's falling in love with your baby or falling in love with the person who becomes your spouse, at least in animal studies, we can see that the proteins are actually folded differently around the genes in your brain. Because this experience happened, because you loved them and they loved you, we have these epigenetic changes that happen in the brain. And there is nothing more physical than that, right? Literal protein refolding. So what we know is that in human neuroimaging studies, it's the same part of the brain that we see activated when we see that yearning for the loved one, as is the same region of the brain that shows these protein changes when the voles bond with each other. So we think there's something conserved across evolution even, meaning bonding with someone is vital for our survival. You two would not be here if you hadn't had an attachment relationship at some point, because someone had to feed you and talk to you for you to become a talking, fully grown human being. So our loved ones are vital to us. And with that attachment, with that bond, comes this deep and enduring belief. I will always be there for you, and you will always be there for me. And so what that means is when we're separated from our loved one, you send them off to school, you send them off to work. When we're separated, we have this belief, oh yeah, they're not in my presence, but they're out there and they still love me. So that if you're separated, there's a simple solution. Go find them, right? Or make such a fuss, they come find you, right? Send them a million texts. And what that enduring belief does is those are the attachment bonds, right? So there's all these neurochemicals in your brain saying, hey, it's been too long since you saw them. Maybe you should go find them now. Or maybe you should send them a text and find out how their meeting went, right? So there's dopamine and opioids and oxytocin. And when you come back together again, your cortisol goes down and your oxytocin goes up, right? Lots of really powerful neurochemicals holding those bonds together in this invisible way. Now, fortunately, in the very uncommon experience that person dies, your brain doesn't just change tack. It says, well, they're not in my presence, so I should go and get them. And so you find yourself still picking up the phone to call them when something happens, or, picking out the grocery store greeting card that's going to be just perfect for your dad. Except he's not going to have any more birthdays, right? And so it takes a long time for your brain to update its predictions, exactly because those bonds mean that we have this everlasting, enduring belief about each other. I'll be there for you, you'll be there for me. And so grief is this unusual moment where you know the reality. You have a memory also in your brain that tells you this person has died. And you have this belief that they're out there. And those two things cannot both possibly be true. And so your brain is wrestling with what the heck is going on? How can I be getting these two different answers at the same time, often very much in our subconscious? And no wonder we can't concentrate on anything, right? Our brain is trying to sort this out in the background. And it means that it takes a long time to be able to predict that they're actually really not coming back. And it means that also we can eventually, that our brain really is designed to learn from our experiences and to improve the life that we have. So there's sort of this, it's both and, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, because you experienced the loss of your mom in your mid-20s, and then you've been studying this and continued and then studied others and then been comparing and contrasting and everything and writing. Has doing your work helped you to understand better your initial responses, maybe to your own grief, or as you go along? Like, how has that impacted your understanding personally?
I think that there is no substitute for understanding the why and the how of grief. I think this is why grief education is so vital. So my dad died about 8 years ago, and it was such a totally different experience for me. I was in my 40s, right? So of course it's going to be a different experience in lots of ways. And my relationship with my dad was really different from my relationship with my mother, as most people have. But I also knew what was happening to me. I knew I was having these intense reactions that I wasn't expecting. And I knew that they would come like a wave and that they would go like a wave. And so I spent less time worrying about whether I was normal. And I spent less time worrying about whether other people thought I was normal. And just that in and of itself was so helpful. And I did know how to reach out to friends and say, am I normal? So I think knowing these things can make a difference. Does that mean I didn't feel grief? No, I had a lot of grief, but it does mean that, I don't know, I sometimes use this word. This is not an empirical word. I felt like the grief was sort of cleaner. Like there wasn't a lot of stuff around it. I just felt this massive weight and sort of awe that this had even happened. And then over time, that weight lifted. And it wasn't as complicated as when my mom died.
My dad died, well, was it last year? I don't know time anymore because I'm very, grief brain, widow brain, whatever. And it was a different relationship, of course, not as close in the same ways as a partner, but it was more like, oh, I know what's going to happen, more predictable in a way. But then sometimes because I thought it was predictable, then when I would have the little sideways things come at me, I was like, what's going on? I should know better because I've been through stuff. So it was interesting just to observe.
And that's such a great way of putting it. Like, I think once you realize grief is going to happen to you, there's sort of a faith there, like, okay, I'm not going to get too worked up about this. It's going to happen. Like I said, it's not that you don't feel it just because you understand how grief works. And at the same time, I don't know, there's just it's useful, just like you were saying.
We talked to, do you know who Dr. Lisa Schulman is? Have you ever heard of her?
Yes.
So we talked to her, and it was so fascinating because I told her that I felt like I had a traumatic brain injury after my husband died. And she was like, yes, I just published a paper on that exact thing. And I was like, oh, that makes me feel, again, like you're saying, it's like just the knowledge of that is so helpful to know that it's not just something that I'm making up, but that my brain is actually having to rewire and refold proteins, and my neurochemicals are different, and my brain is very confused. And so if I'm tired, like, yeah, you are having to figure out the entire life that you had planned out and how your brain had predicted things were going to go has all been upended. And now you have to figure that all out again.
Yeah.
And I just feel like there's so much comfort in knowing that it's not made up, I guess.
Yeah. I think it's almost a shame, but we find it very validating when we can see, mechanical changes in the brain, when we can see that the heart rate goes up, that the cortisol levels go up. I mean, at some level, I think we should just believe each other that this is actually happening to us. But there is something very validating about knowing that it's happening in the brain in this way. And so I think that has proven really interesting to hear people say how it makes it feel more real for them. But I do also, just to be clear, I said grief is just going to happen to you. But what I mean is there's going to be a reaction, and not everyone has super intense grief. And that's okay too, right? Like your brain is going to respond in whatever way it's going to respond. And hopefully over time, over grieving, we learn how to cope with the fact that it's responding this way. We get better at managing the fact that we have waves of grief. But if you don't have an intense grief response, that's okay too. That is how your brain is processing things. When a few months ago, I was talking to a woman, and it had been about 10 days after her husband had died. And she said, I don't admit this to anyone, but I feel like he's gone, like I'm okay. And she literally could not tell her friends this because she felt like a horrible person. Well, you're just having the reaction that you're having, right? You don't get to pick. And so I think that makes sense both when you're having an intense reaction and when you're not having an intense reaction, that it's a whole bunch of things going on that lead to that result.
And then she probably like 2 weeks later was like, just kidding. Worst time of my life. That was me too.
Yeah. Well, in this case, it wasn't denial or suppression, or we stayed in touch for quite a while.
Oh, so it stuck?
Yeah. So this is the thing. We did cognitive testing on her. There was nothing wrong with her. She was about 80 years old. She was not in denial. She'd had grief before. When her father had died, she'd had a strong grief reaction. She was definitely bonded to her husband. But the thing is, life had been challenging with him. And, she had stuck it out for decades, and she loved him. And of course she stuck it out, right? But it didn't mean that at the end of that time that there wasn't a feeling of not exactly even relief, but just, okay, I did that, and now I get to do something else. Yeah. And so I guess that's what I mean. There's nothing wrong with her for having that reaction. You know what I mean?
I feel like no matter what happens, when you're in grief, you actually feel like you might be going crazy.
Yes.
Like if your response is really high, I'm going crazy. If I can't remember that I put my keys in the refrigerator, I'm going crazy. If I feel like I'm doing too well and I'm not having a big enough response, I'm going crazy. Yeah. And I feel like most grievers that I've talked to, they have that period of time where they're like, actually, I think like not even in like the cutesy, like, oh, I'm losing my mind. Like, no, I'm really losing my mind. Absolutely.
Absolutely. It is so different than we anticipate mostly, right? Mostly it's a different reaction than we expect.
So I have a question about yay old voles and us humans. So you said that the same parts of the brain light up in both them when their little cute vole partner gets taken away from them, which is super rude, but okay, we have to do it. And when our partner or spouse dies. Are those same areas, do they light up in a divorce situation? And can you talk to us a little bit about the differences in those types of grief?
Yeah. So if you think about the idea that it's when a bond is broken, right? So when you're not a we facing the world together, functioning in the world together, that's when you get this grief response. But that bond gets broken in lots of different ways, right? It gets broken through divorce. It gets broken through estrangement, even sort of empty nest, right? Your kids go away. You know they're going to go away. You expect them to go away. You want them to live adult lives.
You want them to go away.
Unless you have Munchausen by proxy, but I digress.
But even in that situation, you feel grief, right? Like the bond is disrupted, it's changed. And so I think we do have studies that look at other kinds of loss, breakup of a relationship, for example. And we see very similar responses in those broken bonds as well.
And is it just different, though, because your brain is also trying to reconcile that person is no longer reachable, like they are not on this planet anymore. So there's no more contacting them or discussing or figuring stuff out. They just are poof, gone. And our brain doesn't have a good way of understanding poof, they're gone.
Yeah, it is also different in a few different ways. One, just as you said, there's no, like, they're not lost. It's that there's no map. That's just, I can't wrap my head around that, right? So that happens with death. And we do often see that the grief is more intense with the death of a loved one. But there's this other piece that we know is happening in something like divorce or breakup, where there's often this sense of guilt or blame, right? So you're trying to figure out why. So for the most part, when a loved one dies, there's sort of a way you're trying to figure out why, but there's a unique way of sort of, did I cause this? or I'm so angry that they caused this. So there is that piece of guilt that can operate differently when the relationship is broken for other reasons.
And what about the difference in, say, like a pregnancy loss where you never met that person and, is that bond still made? And is there a difference between somebody who's been married for 60 years and who's really had time to strengthen that bond versus like with the pregnancy loss, that bond has not really had a chance to be fully formed yet because the person hasn't been born yet?
So we do know that the grief prior to birth is there as well. And the attachment bond is there, right? So if you think about it right now, if I ask you, where's your kid and what would you do? How would you get to them? Right? We're holding on to this avatar of our loved one in our head all the time, right? We have a relationship with them in our head as well as in the real world. And what happens is, as soon as you know that you're pregnant, heck, even when you're planning to get pregnant, you're already building this internal representation of that infant, of that child, of that person. And so that those enduring beliefs, then, I will always be there for you, that's present before they're ever born. And so I think that the bond breaking is still there, even if you haven't gotten to hold them or watch them grow up.
The glass lab, grief, loss, and, which we know what those are. I wanted to ask you what you do with the social stress part of this.
Social stress covers a large category, and it was the simplest way to talk about it. So my interest is really, how do we respond physically? How do we respond in the brain when our relationships, when something is going on in our relationships that is causing us stress? And so there has been a small amount of research in my lab looking at things like caregiving for a person with dementia, or experiences of discrimination, the way that we get separated from the people around us because of bad behavior, right? So a few different ways. That sort of covers all the other stuff that I think informs, right? Like, I think it's interesting to think about breaking up with an individual person who was our person in some ways is a different kind of stress than being rejected because of the color of our skin. But it's interesting to think about, in what ways does your brain or your body interpret that differently? And so that's the sort of the reason for that other category.
So it's like, not to water it all down, but just for us, bond breaking across the spectrum.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mel really just wanted to ask you about the Holmes-Rahe scale because that is her favorite thing and she wants it tattooed on her chest.
So what are you thinking of when you say that scale?
Well, stress index, the way that we know about it is like cumulative points of stress. And I know that it was in 1972.
We still use it.
It's helped us a lot to be able to realize why our bodies are maybe so tired, or realize that things are stress even if we didn't think they were going to be stress. Like when you've had partner loss, which is number 1 on the scale, you don't really think of some of the other things that are lower down on the scale as having any stress, but they do. What are your thoughts on the stress index scale and what you do?
I think I've used it myself. I think it's super helpful. I think that, just as you said, the sort of cumulative nature of stress, I think, is really important to think about. So, bereavement never happens in a vacuum. There's other stuff going on, and all that other stuff going on is going to impact how you respond, right? And so, just as you say, it can be really helpful to be like, in fact, I do joke with other psychologist friends where it's like, yeah, I had 3 stressful life events this week. No wonder I feel terrible. Or, I think there is a way in which it's helpful to recognize, even if they're not all losses, that our body reacts, So if you cut your finger making dinner really deeply, you're going to have a physical stress response, right? And so I think we forget then later, oh, my body went through this whole cortisol episode earlier. Maybe that is part of why I'm crying right now. It's not only because I've lost my husband, but also because I just cut the heck out of my thumb, right? And so I guess it's helpful in thinking about these things are all interacting all the time together in our body and our brain.
Well, is there a different response in the brain?
With grief, there is the realization that this person is never coming back, right? There is with trauma, there is the feeling of helplessness, right? So that helpless feeling, that I'm not safe feeling, obviously can come during grief as well. In some ways, I think of them as sort of two different triggers, but we do actually think that I actually do think that they're separable to some degree in terms of their neural systems, even though in many people they are co-occurring. And so, of course, that makes everything messy.
I want someone to study my brain. I'm here to help. I'm here to serve you. Please let me know if there's any way I can help you with an MRI.
The people who participate, I have such admiration for the people who participate in these studies, right? Because you don't know what you're getting into, and they're so generous with both their time and also their bravery, you know?
Do they live near you, or do people travel to you? Where do you find your people?
Mostly they live near me. If you're going to do a brain scan, you got to have them sort of there.
Yeah.
I do some online stuff. And so then it doesn't matter where you are, but obviously that's not physical stuff. So we do have collaboration sometimes, right? So I spent a long time at UCLA. I did a bunch of scans there. I've done scans here, but also this is why it's important to replicate stuff across different labs. But I have colleagues in lots of universities that are doing these kinds of studies.
Mary Frances, this has been a joy and a pleasure. Thank you for letting us just ask you all of the questions. We do need to ask you one final question that's really important. Can we?
Yes, of course.
This is so hard. The hardest one.
Your schooling has not prepared you.
What is your favorite cheese?
My favorite cheese? Ooh, that is a tough call.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to have to go with goat cheese.
Okay. We accept your answer.
Excellent.
She has spoken.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you found this just as fascinating as we did. I think we could have talked to her for like 7 more hours, and she probably was like, can you please let me go? And she felt kidnapped a little bit. But... All right. If you guys want to keep the podcast going, check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/WWDN.
If you'd like to buy us tacos, go to buymeacoffee.com/widowwedonoww.
And please give us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people to find us when they need to find us. And until we get to talk to you again, I'm Anita.
I'm Mel.
I'm Mary Frances O'Connor.
We are 2 young widows and 1 super smart grief expert, and we're all just trying to figure out widow.
We
do
now.
This is my favorite thing to discuss with you.
Tell me, what is it?
One of my favorite things. I do enjoy tacos and cheese and dogs. This is about how you cannot pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars for a phone plan, especially when you're a widow, your person is dead, you might have kids, you might need another option, and you just want your phone to work, you want unlimited texting and service, and you want it to be like $25 a month.
It blows my mind that they have plans that start at $15 a month. That is so cheap. And the cool thing is it uses other 5G networks, and so you don't have to pay extra for that, and you still get great service.
Yep, Anita and I have traveled all over, and I have used my phone. So I highly recommend it, and my mom's even on it. When my dad died, we put his phone down to the cheapest plan, which is $15 a month. And I think my mom's on the $20 a month plan, and it's so worth it. It's so much cheaper than what we were all paying before. So I highly recommend it if you're on a budget or not. Who cares? Ryan Reynolds is in charge of the company, and they send you free stickers with Ryan Reynolds temporary tattoos. It's kind of the best. So if somebody wants to sign up, what can they do, Anita?
Go to trymintmobile.com/WWDN. Seriously, you guys, such a great idea. Save yourself some money.
And if you're worried about losing data or having any changes with your phone, not going to happen. They walk you through it. Everything's fine. It's the easiest process of all time. Again, that's
trymintmobile.com/WWDN.